The Nazis, often famous for their systematic looting of Europe during World War II, seizing countless art treasures, old master paintings, so-called degenerate art, religious artifacts, as well as financial assets. The Nazi war machine was perpetually short on cash and raw materials. They systematically drained the wealth of nations they conquered. As they occupied countries like Belgium and the Netherlands, the Nazis seized their national gold reserves worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Even personal property through the Holocaust, jewellery, wedding rings, watches, even the gold fillings from victims' teeth, real estate and homes and businesses were sold for fractions of their value or simply seized. But there is a second massive shadow operation that took place as the tide of war turned. The Soviet Union didn't just liberate territory, they systematically dismantled and relocated the wealth of Central and Eastern Europe in a process known as compensatory restitution. Unlike the chaotic looting by individual soldiers, the Soviet state formed specialized units called trophy brigades. Their mission was to identify and ship everything of value back to the USSR. By 1945, they had effectively vacuum cleansed Eastern Germany and Poland. Entire factories, steel, cement, chemical power plants, railway tracks, dismantled and shipped east. Over 2,800 factories, 2.6 million artworks, and 6 million books. Virtually every major research lab in Berlin was stripped. Personal items like pianos, sewing machines, and watches, even plumbing fixtures, hundreds of train carloads daily. History has a favourite villain, with Hitler and his personal love of art, as well as the high-ranking Nazi elite, such as Hermann Göring, with a huge stolen art collection. When we talk about the great art heists of World War II, we talk about Hitler's Führer Museum, or the monuments men we've seen in the movies. We know the story of the Nazi gold train. But while the world was watching the Nazis hide their stolen treasures in salt mines and castles, another massive operation was just beginning. It wasn't hidden in the dark, it was carried out in broad daylight, by the trainload under Joseph Stalin's orders. As the Red Army pushed towards Berlin, they wasn't just seeking revenge, they were seeking total repayment for the destruction of their homeland, the largest industrial and cultural plunder in history, one that saw entire factories dismantled screw by screw and millions of masterpieces vanishing into the Soviet vaults for decades. Today we're looking at the trophy brigades, the forgotten looters of World War II, and the billions of dollars they stole. The gold of Troy, Priam's treasure, this is the greatest specific example. It was discovered by Heinrich Schliemann in the 1870s. Being kept in Berlin till 1945, vanished for 50 years, the Soviets denied they had it. It wasn't until the 1990s that they finally admitted it was sitting in the basement of the Pushkin Museum in Moscow. It remains there to this day, a major point of diplomatic tensions between Germany and Russia. The brigades were not composed of random frontline soldiers, but rather experts in their specific fields, who followed immediately behind the combat troops. Curators from major Soviet museums were commissioned as officers. They used high-priority lists to track down trophies that would eventually fill the secret special storerooms of Moscow and Leningrad. In 1995, the Hermitage Museum finally revealed 74 paintings that had been considered lost since the war, acknowledging that they had been held there in storage as trophy art. While the world was returning art in the 1950s and 60s, Russia was formalising its right to keep what it took. The most significant piece of legislation is the Federal Law on Cultural Valuables, displaced to the USSR in 1998. The argument: Russia officially argues because the Nazis destroyed roughly 427 museums, 4,000 libraries, and 1,700 cities, they have a moral and legal right to restitution, effectively nationalising all trophies that are currently on Russian soil, and declaring that masterpieces taken from enemy states, Germany, Hungary, Romania, Finland and Bulgaria, are now Russian state property. The loophole: the law makes it nearly impossible for the original owners to get the items back. To claim an object, a family must provide statements proving it was taken by the Nazis first, or belonged to a victim of the Holocaust. Even then, the claimant often has to pay Russia for the storage and restoration of the piece. Some of the treasures that would be successfully returned: one of the prized masterpieces the Soviets took was the Sistine Madonna, Raphael's masterpiece. The Soviets took it and kept it in a secret box for a decade, and then interestingly, they actually returned it to East Germany in 1955 as a gesture of friendship. The looting wasn't just limited to artifacts, but also people. On a single night in October 1946, the Soviets rounded up over 2,000 German specialist engineers, technicians, scientists, and their families at gunpoint, and then putting them on trains to Russia. The result: German brains helped to build the first Soviet jet engines and the rockets that eventually put Sputnik into space. While the generals were taking factories, the average Soviet soldier was obsessed with trophy goods. In 1945, the Soviet government eventually legalized personal looting to reward the troops, allowing soldiers to send home a 5-kilogram parcel of trophies every month. Officers could send much more. The result: this created a great flow of household goods. It is estimated that tens of thousands of pianos, sewing machines, wall clocks were shipped back to the USSR. In many Soviet villages, having a German piano became a status symbol for decades. The Nazis burned books, but the Soviets moved them. The trophy brigades included a unit called Gossfond, the state agency for literacy. They seized over 6 million books from German and Polish libraries. The tragedy: because there were so many, the Soviets had no place to put thousands of rare 15th century manuscripts. They were stored in damp basements, unheated bars, or even piled up in the open fields where they could simply rot away. The Soviets had a particular obsession with Prussian military history, weapons and armour. They completely emptied the German Historical Museum in Berlin. They took Prince Frederick's personal weapon collection and nearly the entire collection of the 18th century small arms. Stalin's personal loot: it is rumoured that several of Hitler's personal belongings, including his globe and Pacific maps, were taken directly to Stalin's private office. He was obsessed with proof. He didn't just want Hitler's defeat, he wanted Hitler's remains under his thumb. The skull and teeth. For decades, the Soviet Union kept fragments of what they claimed were Hitler's skull and jawbone in a secret box in the FSB, formerly the KGB. Stalin reportedly kept the files close, viewing them as the ultimate trophy of his victory over his rival. Soviet soldiers dismantled the furniture from the Führer bunker, taking a piece of the sofa where Hitler committed suicide and was taken to Moscow for Stalin. These weren't just objects, they were physical proof that his greatest enemy was gone, and interestingly, similar fragments from the same sofa was used in a DNA profile for a Hitler documentary in 2025. One relic lost to history was Hitler's massive custom-made globe in his office. After the Battle of Berlin, the Soviets were photographed with it in Hitler's study. Then it vanished. The theory: many historians believe it was taken on the orders of the secret police chief as a personal gift for Stalin or for the Kremlin archives. It has never been seen public since 1945. Unlike Hitler, who wanted to show off his loot, Stalin became paranoid and kept it secret. He hid the art for years because he didn't want the Allies to use it as leverage in post-war negotiations. The generals' trains. Looting as a reward. Stalin allowed his top generals to loot on a scale that was almost royal. Marshal Zhukov's downfall. Even the great hero of the Soviet Union, Georgy Zhukov, got in trouble for this. When Stalin wanted to sideline him after the war, he used looting as the excuse. The secret police raided Zhukov's private residence and found 70 gold items, 740 pieces of silver, 300 silks, 44 rare carpets, all taken from Germany. In Stalin's Russia, you could loot as much as you wanted, but it remained the state's property. If Stalin wanted to get rid of you, he'd suddenly discover your stolen loot and call it a crime. Is much of the loot still in Russia today? Yes, millions of items are still in Russia. While the Soviet Union returned about 1.5 million items to East Germany in the 1950s as a brotherly gesture to their communist allies, a staggering amount of their loot never left. Today these items are often hidden in plain sight or kept in restricted special storerooms. Here are some of the most significant trophies still in Russia in 2026. The Baladin collection. A Soviet officer named Viktor Baladin literally saved 364 masterpieces, including drawings by Dürer, Van Gogh and Rembrandt, from a cellar in a German castle. He carried them home in his suitcase. He eventually gave them to the Hermitage Museum, where they remain to this day. There have been decades of legal battles to return them to the Bremen Art Museum, but they're still on Russian soil. Double loot is perhaps the most tragic and ethically messy part of the story. It refers to the fact that much of what the Soviet Trophy Brigade seized in 1945 had already been stolen once before by the Nazis from Jewish families. When the Red Army found these hidden treasures in salt mines or castles, They didn't see stolen Jewish property that needed to be returned to its rightful owner. They saw German-owned assets that were now theirs as war reparations. The Nazis had spent years systematically stripping Jewish families in France, Holland, and Poland of their art. These items were often stored in Germany for safekeeping. The reality, when Soviet troops discovered these collections, they had no interest in returning them to their rightful owners. Masterpieces that belonged to the Rothschilds and other prominent Jewish collectors were loaded onto trains heading for the Soviet Union. The stance, even Russia today, largely refuses to distinguish between art that was German-owned and art that the Germans had stolen from Holocaust victims. The artwork was largely never returned to its original owners, with hardly any success stories. Many of the original owners of these artworks perished in the Holocaust, leaving no direct descendants. Heirless artwork that was held in the West was often given to Jewish successor organizations to help survivors, differing from the Soviet approach, arguing since that there was no heirs, the property defaulted to the state that liberated it. This allowed them to keep massive amounts of private wealth, jewellery, gold. Decades have been spent documenting the crimes of the Nazi plunder, but history has a blind spot for the shadow of the Red Star. While one empire stole to fuel a twisted dream of high culture, the other dismantled a continent to settle a debt in blood. Millions of masterpieces and entire cities of industry vanished east. Thanks for watching and considering liking and subscribing.